Well, share prices have dropped and energy prices are rising as the economic impact of the war in the Middle East really begins to bite. The price of crude oil has risen above $100 a barrel as the Strait of Hormuz is effectively closed and Iranian fuel depots are battered. Finance ministers from the world's largest economies will hold an emergency meeting later, including the UK Chancellor Rachel Reeves. Well, any immediate hope of tensions easing has been dashed by the naming of Mojtaba Khomeini, son of Iran's late supreme leader, as his successor. Meanwhile, Iran has launched a fresh wave of missile and drone strikes targeting Israel and Gulf states. And in a potentially significant move, NATO member Turkey says it's deploying 6 F-16s to northern Cyprus. Well, let's start this hour with those growing fears on the energy supply crisis. European markets have slid at the opening in the last hour. Let's get the very latest with our business presenter, Sally Bundock. Sally, tell us more about what's happening with the oil markets and indeed the financial markets.
OK, well, as you know, Mariam, I've been around a long time. And today was one of those days that you don't see very often at all. When I arrived here in the newsroom at sort of 3 a.m. London time, we saw the oil price spiking significantly. It was around about $118 a barrel of Brent. It's now around $107. But as markets opened in Asia, it was the first reaction on global financial markets to all the events that have been taking place over the weekend, of which there has been many. And we've seen a lot of attacks on energy infrastructure in the Gulf, including in Iran itself as well. If we bear that in mind, its main oil production plant was a target over the weekend. So no surprise at all that we saw a spike in the price of oil, but it was immediate and within minutes. A 20% spike within minutes.
Wow.
At the open of trade in Asia. No surprise then that Asian financial markets started to tumble. At one point, Japan was down some 8%. We had South Korea down around a similar level. They had to suspend trade because they hit that point where you suspend trade because it is all too frantic. Japan shut today down over 5% lower, Australia 3% down. So it's been a really torrid session. In Europe, we are seeing declines on the share markets, FTSE down nearly 2%, other markets across Europe, Germany, France down around 2.5%. Europe is not as exposed to the direct impact of what's going through the Straits of Hormuz as Asia. Some of those key markets in Asia, Japan, South Korea, China, they get their oil and gas and energy and other things, by the way, from ships coming through that strait. So that's partly why we see such a massive reaction there. But also as well, we have to bear in mind that Japan and South Korea have seen record highs on their stock markets for weeks and weeks and weeks. So to some degree, you could argue that it's an excuse to take some profits. But as you've mentioned, we've got G7 finance ministers announcing an emergency meeting this afternoon. The worry is, how long is this going to go on for? Because if it does last a long time, the economic and financial risks are great. A prolonged conflict on the global economy could have a serious impact on inflation. You've got central banks watching this like a hawk, the Federal Reserve, the Bank of England and others. So there is a real concern. And at the moment, we're looking at oil prices at a 4-year high. So last time we were at this point with oil prices was when Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022. So that's where we're at with financial markets. We're watching it all very closely. And that's it from me today. But my colleague Ben Thompson is here.
Thank you so much, Sally.
And he'll be keeping us all up to date as well.
Thanks for keeping across the markets. As you said, an incredible day for the markets around the world so far. Well, let's talk a little bit more detail now about what's happening in those Gulf states. Let's cross live to our correspondent Nick Beake, who is in Dubai for us. We've been hearing from Sally Bundock there about the impact on the oil markets. Of course, it's not just about oil in the Gulf states. It's about business, tourism, reputation. What has the impact been of these 10 days of Iranian attacks on those Gulf states, Nick?
Well, good morning, Mariam. And this morning we have had another alert here, and that is to say that the UAE authorities have said that they've been dealing with another Iranian attack. They describe it as a missile and a drone attack. Also, as well as people here obviously being very vigilant in Dubai, in Abu Dhabi, we've heard that 2 people were injured, one of them with moderate injuries, the other with minor injuries, after an interception. So once again, this Gulf country is coming under attack and having to deal with that. Over the weekend in Dubai, there was a near miss at the main international airport, and a man was killed on Saturday night when debris fell down. And just, Mariam, if I could bring you sort of a bit more about the ongoing impact economically, and listening to you talk to Sally there, Bahrain, there have been at least 2 attacks today of note. One of them, the health ministry saying 32 people were injured in what they said was a drone attack. But separately, there was a strike on an oil refinery. There was a fire, which we're now told is under control. But as a result of that, Bahrain's state-owned energy company has declared force majeure. So basically, this is to say that it's unable to fulfill its contractual obligations because of an extraordinary event. So in other words, they're saying this is out of the ordinary. So this is once again an impact that we're seeing today.
OK, Nick, thank you very much indeed for that. Nick Beek there in Dubai. Well, as we mentioned, the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, will be taking part in that emergency meeting of finance ministers from the world's largest economies later today to discuss the economic fallout of the war, including those oil reserves we're talking about with Sally. Let's cross live to Westminster and speak to our chief political correspondent, Henry Zeffman, who actually is not quite ready for us. So let me just bring you a few new lines that we're getting in the last few minutes while Henry gets his microphone on. I can see him getting ready, so just bear with me. In the last few minutes, we had some news from Akrotiri, in Cyprus. We are hearing now of a new security alert, which is briefly triggered in the Akrotiri region, and not long ago, actually, about 45 minutes ago. We've been told that a warning message was sent to residents. The message said there was an ongoing security threat, and it also urged people to remain inside their homes, stay away from windows, and to take cover behind or beneath sturdy furniture while awaiting further instructions. That warning and alert was lifted just 11 minutes later. Now, remember, there's context here. There was a drone strike on the airbase in Cyprus, in that area, in the hangar at RAF Akrotiri last week, and that drone strike which hit the hangar has worried local residents a lot because they are now wondering what next for them. But we're hearing now of another alert which was lifted only a few minutes after it was issued. We'll bring you a little bit more on what's happening in Cyprus in a moment, but I'm being told that Henry is now ready. There you are, Henry. I just said let's cross live to Henry, and you weren't ready for me. You were putting your microphone on. So there we are. Talk to me a little bit about this G7 meeting, Henry. What are we expecting from G7 leaders, and how urgent now is the need for those oil reserves to be very much in focus?
Yeah, it's really interesting, this meeting, which has been called in just the past few days by France. That's because the French government holds the presidency of the G7 at the moment, which rotates year by year. So Rachel Reeves will be taking part virtually in this meeting. It's a virtual-only meeting. Of course, worth remembering, by the way, just in case some people are forgetting which countries make up the G7, it does include the US, so we assume that the US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent will be part of this meeting. But yeah, the really interesting element to this is that, according to the Financial Times, which broke the story of this meeting, the director of the International Energy Agency, a man called Fatih Birol, will be there. And that's interesting because obviously, as we're reflecting this morning, energy is one of the big implications of this conflict, but also the members of the International Energy Agency all hold stockpiles of oil, and those stockpiles can be released in order to counter oil price surges. That last happened in 2022 in the aftermath of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and it seems possible that it might happen again in the coming weeks.
And let me just ask you about this. We're hearing that the Prime Minister is going to be visiting a community centre in London to speak to businesses, parents and pensioners about how the government is protecting British people from the impacts of the conflict in the Middle East. What are we expecting there, Henry?
I'm expecting him to focus on the cost of living, to try to sort of display that he understands the concerns that people have, less sort of geopolitically and more economically here in the UK. Some of the words that I'm told he'll talk about people are rightly worrying what this means for life at home, their bills and their jobs. He'll say that no matter the headwinds, his focus will be supporting working people and their families with the cost of living. And I'm sure he will reel off that list of measures that we've heard from him before, that is now pretty familiar to many people here in the UK, about how he's frozen rail fares, about how he's helping with the cost of childcare, how he's raising the minimum wage. But I think there is a growing recognition, fear perhaps is the right word, at the top of government here in the UK, that the impact of any of those measures could well be dwarfed before long by the impact of this war.
Henry, good to see you. Thank you very much indeed.